to do it. Okay. Terry comes up to me. He says, hey, I'd like to get you an audience of not just students, but everybody around the campus and around the community. We will also record it, make a nice high-quality presentation that will go out the website, and you will reach probably more people than you ever have at any given time. What do I got to do? You just got to put together a talk. On what? On whatever you want. Okay. So this is my chance to try to fulfill this dream that I've had of laying out in as concise and as quickly as I possibly can the reasons why I found myself very compelled on my own by the logic, by the underlying logic, not any particular finding, not any particular paper that was put out there in the evolutionary literature, but the entire logic about human nature, about natural selection that drove the whole process forward was something that I found compelling. I found it beautiful. And if I can encapsulate it in 15 minutes, like I'm hoping to do, I will have failed, I will have succeeded, whereas previously I have given several attempts with mixed success to introductory psychology, moral cognition psychology, developmental psychology, social psychology, and research methods students. This will be the first success. All right, so here we are, the good, the bad, and the evolutionary. That is Charles Darwin down there as the evolutionary. And we are going to talk about, because I'm such a big fan of it, the brain. We're psychologists. We talk about the brain. We like the brain. I'm a big fan of the brain. I think it's wonderful. I think it's special. But in a sense, it is not special. The brain is but one organ in a body full of organs. We understand the brain under the same principles that we would understand the functioning of any other organ. But it doesn't stop there. The organs in the human body are just part of an organism that is part of the larger biological world. Everything in the biological world that requires an explanation from natural selection is in kind of the same boat. There is one underlying compelling logic that gives us answers across the entire biological spectrum about how it got that way. And to present those ideas, I give to you Richard Dawkins. Here doing one of the least offensive things that he might have done during this particular episode of South Park. Okay. Dawkins, in many of his books, makes this point. I think it was particularly compelling in The Blind Watchmaker. Okay, so here's some logic as laid out in The Blind Watchmaker. What we are looking for, the question, the big, large question that we are looking to answer is about complicated things. Complicated things everywhere deserve a very special kind of explanation. We want to know how they came into existence and why they are so complicated. If we see something complex out there, we don't assume that it just got there randomly. Okay? What he says is that the difference between things that we need to explain and things that we don't need to explain is complexity. Biology is the study of complicated things that have the appearance of being designed for a purpose. As contrasted to that, physics is the study of simple things that do not tempt us to invoke design. That's not generally true. Temptation is everywhere. But in general, the temptation to say this must be designed for a purpose doesn't follow things like, for example, Mount Doug. Okay? There is only one Mount Doug. There is only one configuration of rocks that would give us Mount Doug. But if Mount Doug were different in many, many other aspects, it would still be a mountain. It would still serve whatever purpose a mountain might serve. And there's no particular reason that Mount Doug has to be arranged in this particular way to be the particular kind of thing that it is. Okay? On the other hand, some examples inspired from last week. Here is a hand gripping an object. A hand is a particular configuration of matter that is so highly unlikely relative to its function that it necessitates some explanation as to how it got that way. In fact, there are two things in this picture which require an explanation of how they got that way. The hand and the can, Richard Dawkins would say, are both, in fact, products of natural selection. But we'll leave that. Natural selection, the problem that a lot of people have is that it is basically driven by random, chaotic, and destructive forces. Mutation, cosmic rays, random chance, things that normally kill a person. If I randomly were to reorganize a bit of your anatomy in the brain with, say, an ice pick, it is likely that your brain will become less rather than more functional. Okay? Not for sure, but almost certainly. Nature is made up of these random chaotic forces. So how do we get organized design? Well, basically, through these random and chaotic forces, there is the very, very rare instance in which shoving an ice pick into your brain does make it more functional. Natural selection is the process by which these random chances, the very, very rare one of which increases functionality, are accumulated throughout time into a design. This is an illustration from one of Dawkins' books about how small changes in a patch of cells that are sensitive to light, then are invaginated, then are filled with liquid, and then are membraned, create, in a relatively short period of evolutionary time, the vertebrate eye. But it is a collection of small steps, each one of which was relatively unlikely on its own, making a whole structure which was incredibly unlikely and would never, in the whole history of universal time that we've had to work with, have ever come together all at once. The upshot of this explanation is that you do not get complexity for free. Complexity does not come you willy-nilly out of the ether all at once. You have to have some reason for complexity, and natural selection is the only known force that works to build complex functionality. If you've got something complex, if it is functional, it is a product of natural selection. It's easiest to understand in the biological world, but I think it's true of just about everything. The currency of natural selection is a history of reproductive success. The only reason that it got included, the only reason that improvement has become standard equipment is because it has outproduced other variants. It has outproduced other possibilities. So the only reason you get complex design is because we have had variants and one of them has reproduced better than another. So we're talking about reproduction, and that's what makes us complicated. So this history of reproductive success, we'll leave here. This is called the adaptationist paradigm. It lets us ask about anything in the biological world sensible questions. The only reason that these questions, what is it for? How did it enhance reproduction when it evolved? And in other words, what adaptive problem did a certain adaptation solve? These questions only make sense given the background of the logic that I just laid out. If it's complicated, it must be for something. If it's for something, what it was for was indirectly or directly enhancing reproductive success. So every time we come across complex functionality, such as I would assume everybody would agree that the brain is complex and that the brain is functional, it will have as its root cause of that complex functionality the increase of reproduction. So the question is, what is the function of the brain? What does it do? At a general level, I would contend that the brain is an information processor. Its job is to process information in the same way that our small intestine's job is to process nutrients, or our liver's job is to process poisons, or our kidney's job is to filter poisons as well, or our eye's job is to gather light in such a way that it makes sense eventually visually to the cortex. Okay? Our brain's function is to process information. That gets us to our next big leap in evolutionary psychology, kind of a non sequitur from where I was coming from, but in a certain way not. What kind of information processing machine have we got housed in our skulls? The traditional approach to any psychology, and the approach that makes the most sense based on how we experience ourselves, is that we've got this ability to reason in our brains, and we have a brain that is able to figure things out and come to the right conclusion because we're so damn smart. Okay? We are highly intelligent, we can take information, put it together in a problem, solve that problem, and so we have in our skulls, over all kinds of problems that we could possibly have, a domain general machine, one brain to figure out any problem. It is known otherwise as a do the right thing machine. It is a machine, a biological machine that figures out what the right thing is to do and does it. Good for us, we are so smart. The evolutionary psychologist would have a bit of a problem with that. They say from an engineering standpoint, the do the right thing machine is not quite as plausible as we might think. Here's an example of what such an object might look like. This is Stop It. It stops leaks. It stops taxis. It stops people smoking. It stops babies crying. It stops elephants. It stop it, an all-purpose machine, an all-purpose product, okay? The concept of stop is incredibly simple. The application of the concept stop across different problem domains is incredibly complex. There is no product that you could make in a can that would fulfill all of the stopping that you have to do in your life. Any product like Stop It would at the very least have to incorporate a plumber's wrench for stopping the leak, a whistle for stopping the taxi, Nicorette or a patch for stopping the smoking, a pacifier for stopping the baby, and an elephant gun for stopping the baby crying. I mean the elephant, okay? All of those things, if you put them into one object, would not be an object with one function. It would be all in one place, an object that has many functions. So in a sense, it would be like a Swiss Army knife. They're all there in one place physically, but it's an array of different functions, okay? As humans, we have not just had a couple of functions built in, we have an explosion of different functions, different ways of processing information about different problems. And so instead of this simple machine like this, I would say that our brain would look, well, we just skipped over it, would look something a little bit more like this Swiss Army knife, okay? It's a collection of functions. It's one Swiss Army knife, fine, but it is at its root a collection of different functions. Now that we have these things down, let's start thinking about science. Now we're a scientist, and we can start thinking about these ideas. How does this apply to psychology? Well, here is the manifesto, if I can give it in just a little few words. Bits of brain are there because they have a history of processing information, that's what they do, in such a way as to enhance reproduction. What is this information like? What kind of information are we dealing with? We're specifically dealing with information that was persistently present and available over and relevant over evolutionary time. You need time to put these adaptations together. So if that information wasn't present over the time that it would take to put the adaptation together, then you wouldn't have an adaptation. We are not responding to things in our modern environment, which have been around for 50 years, with the dedicated machinery that evolution has given us in our brain, at least not for the purpose of dealing with things like Kool-Aid or sweetener or condoms. Okay, I'll get into that later if I have time. So the information that was present over evolutionary time. Evolutionary psychology is a cognitive science. It is concerned with the kind of physical brain that evolution has given us, the kind of physical brain that natural selection would build given the selection pressures that were on the organism at the time. Evolutionary psychology is not necessarily about behavior. Genes code for proteins, proteins code for tissues, tissues code for mechanisms. Those mechanisms in interaction with the environment are likely to give rise to a certain behavior, but that behavior was not coded for. It is your brain which is coded for, and so we're looking for cognitive mechanisms instantiated in bloody brain that were present in the ancestral past, but they would still be with us today. So the evolutionary psychologist hypothesizes the current design of the brain based on some knowledge of known evolutionary forces, leading to the conclusion that our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, encapsulated in one pithy phrase, okay? That is the Geico case.